I'm calling up now Steve Roberts, PhD, Chief Scientific Officer from Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance. Steve leads the development and execution of the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance scientific strategy through partnerships with individuals affected by TSC, researchers, healthcare providers, government agencies, nonprofits, and other stakeholders. As Chief Scientific Officer since 2011, he's led the creation and growth of the TSC Preclinical Consortium to accelerate testing of new treatments and the TSC Biosample Repository. Steve's one of the most enjoyable collaborative allies we have when it comes to imparting the wisdom of a Chief Scientific Officer to us and embodying the kind of leadership every organization would benefit from when developing their research network. He's been incredibly generous with his time and insights across our first two Data DIY series, and if we haven't exhausted him yet, I think we may be seeing him even more from him and the TS Alliance in this series. So come on up and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thank you. Okay, and for advancing the slides, just use this. Use the keys. All right. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure. And I didn't write all of that intro, by the way, so thank you. That was very generous. So what I wanted to talk about today was using patient data when in certain conversations with the FDA. And so really what you're going to hear is our story, our one experience with the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance of doing this. And so you could hear different stories, I'm sure, from different organizations and different groups about how they've done this. But I can really speak best from our own experience. So to give you that perspective, and here it is, big green button. So to give you that perspective of our story, I wanted to tell you a little bit about just 2 slides on TSC and the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance so that you understand where we're coming from. So tuberous sclerosis complex is a rare genetic disorder. It causes tumors to grow in multiple vital organs of the body, but primarily the brain, kidney, lungs, eyes, skin, and some others. But the neurological manifestations are often the most impactful to quality of life. So things like epilepsy, autism, developmental delay, behavioral issues. And TSC is actually one of the leading genetic causes of autism and epilepsy, if you want to be considered a leader in that respect, because our prevalence, our incidence is about 1 in 6,000 live births, so we estimate there are about 50,000 people in the US with TSC and more than 1 million worldwide. So while we qualify as an orphan disease and a rare disease, we're of course not as ultra rare as some of the others. But because TSC is so different from person to person, it's almost a spectrum of multiple rare disorders within TSC, if you will. So another thing that I wanted you to know is the TS Alliance has been around for 45 years. We were founded in Southern California in 1974 by 4 mothers around a kitchen table, the way that many, if not most, rare disease nonprofits have been founded. But that's 45 years ago, so we've grown since then. We have a CSO, and I know that's not the position of most of those of you in the audience, but I think that some of the things that we've learned, you can still take advantage of, and you don't have to be as big or as old as we are to do them. We've always been committed to developing programs for support services and education and helping people who are living with TSC, really stimulating and sponsoring research for TSC, and also educating the public and professionals about TSC. So to jump right into one of our projects, our registry, which we call the TSC Natural History Database, was created in 2006. So I spoke a little bit about this at the DIY workshop number 1. So I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail, but I did want to just remind you all kind of what it is, where it came from, and some of the experiences we've had. So when it was created, it was actually a federal grant that was awarded to an investigator at one of our TSC clinics around the country, but it was rapidly realized that this might be a stronger and more sustainable project if the TS Alliance were really put at the center of it. And so from the beginning, the TS Alliance has really been driving the project, and we've been funding it ever since the expiration of that grant. So the governance is the TS Alliance controls the database. I struggle with the word own. What does that mean? The participants own the data. As you've heard, they can withdraw their consent at any time and have their data removed. So it's not as though we own the data, but we do own or control the database, if you will. And we use guidance of a steering committee of clinician researchers. So they give us input on kind of the designs of questions and things like that from a clinical point of view. Funding sources over the years have included research fundraising. So just from our general research fundraising, we help support the costs of this. From individual major donors, some have said, this is a really important project, we're going to give you, X thousands of dollars towards this. And we've also done some partnerships with pharma. And so I want to elaborate a little bit on some of these points. So first of all was the source of the data. So as I mentioned, the steering committee is clinicians, and we made a strategic decision in 2006. I joined in 2011, so this was a bit before my time. A strategic decision to utilize and leverage an existing network of TSC clinics around the country to gather clinical data on TSC, to try to document a natural history, if you will, of progression of the disease. So there are some reasons that might work in TSC and might not be your first choice. But I wanted to put those on the table. So first of all, with an estimated 50,000 Americans with TSC, there's a really large sample size. And so getting clinical data from even a couple of thousand still gives us a really good sample size and proportion, but we weren't trying to reach every person in the country. And some diseases that are very, very rare, it's really important that you reach everyone, and you just can't, it may not work to work through clinics. But for us, we felt like it did. It also shifted the burden of taking that medical data and entering it into a database format off of the parents or the caregivers or the patients themselves in the case of independent adults. But it required significant financial commitment from the TS Alliance. So it was, again, a strategic decision that the Alliance made at that time to say, we will support this with funding to help support some time of people at the clinics to enter data into the database. And of course, all data collection requires that IRB approved informed consent. So before anything is collected by the clinic, it's not just done from their medical records. First, there's an informed consent process of the patient or their legal guardian to get that approval that they want to participate, which they can withdraw at any time. So as I mentioned, there have been different financial sources for support over the years, and I wanted to bring up one example of pharma partner support that really let us take our database to the next level for us. So that was with Novartis, actually. So in 2006, when we created it, we built the database with a partner that somebody on our board or staff. Again, I wasn't there, so I don't necessarily get all the details. I remember all the details, but a connection of the TS Alliance with this person who was really a software database expert. And so because of that relationship and the ability to get it done at a very reasonable cost, it made sense at the time to build this custom database. And of course, things like Invitae didn't exist at the time, so there were fewer options. The problem that arose is that 6 years later in 2012, we'd enrolled over 1,000 people in this database, and now it was becoming very cumbersome to use. Some of the lessons or recommendations that you heard earlier in the day were things that we had not followed, right? So things make Megan's smiling, right? You always learn, but at least we started, right? But you always learn things that you wish you had done differently. And it was really hard to get data out because you were always working with this guy who'd custom built this database. And so there's this time delay in the translation of what you really want and all of that. And so it was really beginning to feel like a heavy weight. And so we were fortunate that Novartis was really interested in collecting certain kinds of data that were, of course, well, not necessarily of course, but they were of interest to TSC and the TS Alliance as well. Some more details about the status of epilepsy and the growth of these tumors in the brain and tumors in the kidney that Novartis was developing a drug to help treat. So they wanted, it would be beneficial to them to be able to gather data, but we already had this this registry or this database running. And so rather than try to create one and compete with it, they said, could we work together? And you add these questions to the database, and we'll help support that funding. And we said, yeah, we can do that. We should really move this to a better platform. So let's do that. We can add the fields that are of interest, because it wasn't stretching anything. It's things we were interested in too. And the TS Alliance still controls all the data, and we can share the data with anybody. So it was done not with Novartis saying, if you collect it, we have exclusive access. They didn't say that, and in fact, they didn't want that. They said, we want to have the data, but yes, it's part of your database. And so you can share it in the same way that you share other data. And so that was really a big boost for us to be able to do that, really switching to this platform, growing the number of people that we could, that were enrolled in it. We switched to study tracks. This is a small company. Sorry, just shows up a little different than the way I had it. Study Tracks is a company in Georgia, just very small, but it was founded by a guy who is a clinical data scientist himself. And he was filling this niche for the collection and the analysis of clinical study data or clinical trial data. And so, while a different platform might be more desirable if you were asking for patient-reported outcomes, things like that, for clinical data, this platform made sense to us. And it really streamlined the reports. It's got the top security, meets all the HIPAA requirements and everything else, and it has an audit history, so we know what has been changed and when. So that was a big change for us back in 2012. That's completed. Our contract with Novartis is done. They've used the data. They've done some publications with the data, and it's still all ours, even though the contract with them has expired now. So I wanted to share with you some of the basic data flow, which at one level is pretty obvious. So we gather data from clinical sites. It goes into the natural history database. Researchers apply to us, say this is the question we want to ask. I think we heard earlier from Liz, one of the reviews we do is really to make sure that the question they want to ask can be answered by the data we collect and the way that we collect it. Because if they're looking, for example, for patient preference data, they're not going to get that. That's not what we're collecting. So we have that level of review, and then it goes out to researchers. And these can be clinical researchers, basic researchers, pharma researchers. We'll share it with anybody who's interested in TSC and who has a good question that can be suitably addressed with the data or a subset of the data that we collect. But there's another path to this, and that is that sometimes researchers will want to ask additional questions. And they'll say, well, what about this? We're doing one right now on pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors. So they're relatively rare in TSC, but they keep popping up in the literature or in clinical practice, and we don't really understand them. And a researcher wanted to know more about the clinical data that exists on people with these neuroendocrine tumors. And so what we do is we add these questions to the database, go back to the clinical sites, they enter the relevant data for those new questions that are added, and then those can go out to the researchers. So over time, it's not just a one-way flow, it's actually a cycle or a cyclical flow of, we have data, they may lead to questions, we can ask new questions for data, collect that, and keep going around. But with all of that, a natural history database, our database of clinical data, doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell the patient's story and the patient's view of the journey and the disease and how it affects them. And so in talking about, the theme of this talk being communicating data with to the FDA, I want to shift gears just slightly now from the registry side of things and the clinical data side of things to that complementary piece, which is really the patient's point of view and how it affects them, and in some ways more valuable and more impactful than even the clinical data. So the reason we happened upon this was that there was a need for FDA engagement in TSC. This was back, I want to say about 2015 when we first started thinking about this. So TSC affects every individual differently, and even identical twins are not identically affected, and that's a little different talk we can have if you want to talk about the genetics. There are existing FDA-approved treatments. They're not cures. They help the disease, but they're not enough. They don't help everyone. And there are more new treatments in development. And so we felt like it was that important time to have a conversation with FDA about the remaining unmet needs, and not so they weren't just thinking, oh, you've got this one thing on the market, you should be fine, which is not the case. The risks of TSC also are very high. This is usually diagnosed within the first year of life. Seizures are often the first presenting clinical symptom, although we can identify babies before birth, and I'll touch on that. So the risks of this disorder are very, very high. About 50% develop autism, 85% develop epilepsy, and 2/3 of those are intractable epilepsy. It's not controlled by drugs or by surgery. So there's a lot at risk here with the progression of this disease. And so when you're thinking about new therapies, this also raises the bar for parents or patients of the level of risk they might be willing to accept, because the risk of the disease is already so high, right? And we wanted to have that discussion with the FDA. And then the possibility of preventing some manifestations. So I mentioned the seizures as the first presenting clinical symptom, but more and more often, especially in the past few years, it's been more common to identify a certain tumor that grows in the heart of infants during fetal development with TSC. And so on prenatal ultrasound, it's being more common that these tumors are being identified, and if that gets the attention of the right physicians, they should suspect TSC and seek to rule that out. So more and more we're getting babies that have suspected TSC while they're still in the womb, and then that can be confirmed after birth. And this is usually 4 to 8 months before the onset of seizures. So there's an opportunity of preventing some of these manifestations. And then some things like the kidney tumors in TSC don't come on until childhood or adolescence or maybe even early adulthood. And so clearly if a child is diagnosed with TSC younger, there's an opportunity to prevent the kidney tumors altogether. And so again, that's a discussion to have with the FDA. And so I want to dive into each of these 4 in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. So when we think about communicating with FDA, I think a key point is really speaking their language, right? So you want to make sure that what you're trying to communicate fits into a model that they're receptive to, right? You basically want to communicate it in a way that makes sense to the people who you want to understand it. Otherwise, your message may be lost. And so we decided to take forward and think about as kind of the framework for this discussion, and I'll talk about patient-focused drug development meetings very specifically, to utilize FDA's benefit risk assessment framework as the basis for the meeting and the discussions with FDA. So what this is, if you haven't heard of it, it's actually a tool that FDA uses during the evaluation of approval of a new drug application. And it really has 4 main categories, and they're on the left. The analysis of the condition, the current treatment options, the benefit of this new therapy, and the risk, and how do you manage the risks of the new therapy. So the first 2 rows are actually very generic to the disease and not specific to any one therapy. For example, if for some reason we were lucky enough to have 3 new treatments coming forward through FDA at the same time, this framework would be filled out, the top 2 rows would be identical for all 3 of those, right? The analysis of the condition today and the current treatment options today would be the same for all of those. And so this is something that we can communicate to the FDA, what is the condition like? What's it like to live with the disorder? How does it affect people's ability to feel and function? And what are the current treatment options and how well do they work or not work? And what else are we looking for? The benefit and the risk are all a balance, right, between the top 2 things, but also what are the benefits and the side effects or the unknowns of the new treatment. And so the bottom 2 rows you really can't fill out in advance. You need to have the clinical data from the new drug application. But the first 2, we can essentially give them the answers. And so that's where we were coming from. So analysis of condition, just to dig into it, this is really how the disease affects individuals. So what is it like to live with the disease in the caregiver's words or the patient's words? What are the most bothersome aspects of the disease? Sometimes clinicians, and I'm sure we're all aware of stories like this, clinicians think that one aspect of the disease is the most bothersome, maybe because it bothers them, right? And it's very obvious and it's on the outside. But if you ask people living with the disease, that may bother them less than something else that's harder to see, whether it's clarity of thought, forgetfulness, inability to sleep at night, or disrupted sleep patterns. We want to communicate how the disease impacts daily living, and we want to include various perspectives. So in a disease like TSC, where it's highly variable from person to person, we wanted to be sure to include stories of people and perspectives of people who are affected differently, so FDA gets the whole picture. In terms of current treatment options, I don't want us to think just about treatment as drugs or devices for that matter. They can be medical care, so drugs or devices, whether they're FDA approved or not, supplements, et cetera. They could include behavioral or occupational therapies. Some people use equine therapy in TSC for people who have problems with behavior and communication, and having horse therapy, being able to ride on this horse, can have a very beneficial effect to quality of life, not only for the individual, but the caregivers who are living around them. Or there could be things like self-compensating for lifestyle modifications. Well, I handle that, I handle the risk of something happening by, outside by not going outside, right? I stay in my house all the time. Things like that. So there are different ways of treating the disease than what's just a drug. And then a key question is, how much do these things help? Okay, so you're doing all these, and then how much do they help you or not? And then it gets a bit more speculative, right? What are the benefits that patients or caregivers most desire from future treatment options? So short of a cure, which of course is what any one of us would want, is just to eliminate it, what would be an ideal treatment? What would really help? And what level of improvement in which symptoms would you consider most meaningful or beneficial for how you or your loved one feels or functions? Right? So getting very specific about, this is how the disease bothers me, but now this is the piece that we really need treated better. This is what would really make a difference. Which symptoms are the most bothersome? And then there's the preventative aspect that I mentioned. So how do we start to think about and address how we would deal with the risks of preventative treatments? So I already mentioned the fact that infants with TSC may be identified in utero with the cardiac tumors, and that some manifestations like the renal and lung manifestations occur later in life. So what this leads to is a need to treat what appear to be healthy people for the time being in a preventative manner to prevent the devastation of the disease that could come. So, I chose all of these pictures that I've chosen are children or participants from our patient-focused drug development meeting. And you have one here who is maybe not having seizures, is developmentally normal, living a normal childhood, but yet knowing that still within the next year or so, there's a risk of developing seizures. And if those seizures start, then there's a risk of developmental delay that may be irreversible. And this little girl who's sitting in the sun may not be able to sit up 6 months from now if the disease is not prevented, and then if the seizures start and they can't be adequately controlled. So these are risks that are going on in the minds of parents and patients that the FDA needs to be aware of. And so the communicating this patient perspective, as I've mentioned, we did through a patient-focused drug development meeting. So just to give you a couple background points on PFDD meetings. These were developed after the PDUFA 5, the Reauthorization Act, back in 2012. The PDUFA 5 contained legislation authorizing FDA to hold a certain number of patient-focused drug development meetings. And it turned out they could fund about 20, and I think they exceeded that a little bit, 20 to 25 in that first 5 years. So clearly that's not all the diseases. Right? And so there were a number of patient advocacy groups that wanted to have patient-focused drug development meetings that FDA was not choosing to hold, right? And so we were one of those. We were not the first, which is good because we could follow some people and learn from them. But those meetings began in 2015, and so as they were beginning, we thought, well, this would be great for us. The timing seems right. How can we do this? And so we started looking into this. And so as a result, FDA has developed actually a process for these externally led meetings. And I'll walk you through a bit of what we did on that. And that way, they ensure that FDA will participate. So if you get their buy-in to be part of this meeting, then you can count on them being there when the meeting is held. And then upcoming, there's some draft guidance being developed. I think the first one's been released, and there'll be some more. Under the 21st Century Cures Act and the PDUFA 6, there was authorization for FDA to do that. So there'll actually be more written guidance from FDA on how to do these things. So the TS Alliance, we had to think about, well, what are we going to talk about in this meeting? This disease affects people in many different ways. There are these huge important topics between epilepsy in infants and young children on the one hand, and then the effects on adults with kidney and lung tumors that can, or cysts that can be life-threatening. What are we going to talk about? They have different endpoints and how you measure the progression of those diseases or the effects of treatments, and they involve different review divisions at the FDA. How do we do this? So our answer was, we'll have one meeting, but we'll have 2 sessions. So we decided, we talked to FDA and their patient engagement group and got their buy-in to have a day-long meeting instead of a half-day meeting. But in the morning, we would talk about the impact on infants and children with TSC, so primarily focusing on epilepsy and behavioral and neuropsychiatric issues. And then in the afternoon, we would talk about things that affect adults, like TSC, renal and lung manifestations. Now, I've thrown up something here called LAM, and this is important, and then I'll refer to it in the coming slides. LAM is short for lymphangioliomyomatosis, so we don't want to say that too many times. And that's a manifestation of TSC that affects the lungs. It occurs almost exclusively in women. I just saw actually this week a paper was published on the 5th man known to have LAM, clinical LAM, symptoms of LAM. And it's due to mutations in the TSC1 or 2 genes, primarily the TSC2 gene. So some women develop LAM without having any other aspects of TSC. And so before the genetics were known, we knew they were related because some women with TSC developed LAM, but then you had this other population that developed the lung manifestations, but they had no epilepsy, they had no autism, they didn't have any brain, no malformations in the brain, nothing. And so once the genetics came along, we found out that the mutations, the genes causing LAM were actually the same genes. It's just that the people are genetically mosaic. They don't have the mutations in all of their cells like most people with TSC do. They have them in a subset of their cells. So it turns out these genes are really the same biochemical pathways, genetic and biochemical pathways, and so there's a lot to be learned from each other. But we've really developed different patient support mechanisms, right? Because on the one hand, you've got a disease that exclusively affects women post-puberty, and then on the other, you've got the disease that affects children and adults, but really severe effects generally in the children. So what do you do when you've got that? Well, you partner with them, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So in terms of the process of having the PFDD meeting, it really involved this letter of intent that I'll talk about briefly, then preparing for the meeting, holding the meeting itself, and then following up and communicating the outcomes of the meeting. So the letter of intent we submitted, if you can read it, May 31st, 2016. We held our meeting on June, I want to say 19th, 2017. So it was fully more than a year in advance. Doesn't have to be that far in advance, but I would allow at least 9 months, I think, to make sure it gets through the FDA process and that you've got that buy-in before you've really committed too much to the meeting. There's information, there's a link on here, and I know the slides will be available. There's a shortened link to the externally led PFDD page by the FDA. It's got a lot of instructions and guidance and people whom you can contact at FDA to really learn about this. Then the preparation. This was the longest and in many ways the toughest part, right? So we want to communicate this, but we've only got a morning to talk about one part of the disease and an afternoon to talk about the other, and it affects people very differently. How do we capture all this and distill it down? So we started by saying, well, let's ask the community, right? I mean, we are the only national advocacy organization for TSC, but we don't want to pretend that we already have all the answers and that we know all the answers. And we want to hear it in the voices of the patients and caregivers. And so we got together a focus group where we had 4 parents of a child with TSC. We had 3 adults with TSC, and 2 of them were also parents of kids with TSC, so that's actually 6 parents of children. We had 2 parents of dependent adults with TSC. We had 2 adults who were living with LAM, but never had the neurological manifestations or other aspects of TSC. And then we had a sister of an adult who had both TSC and LAM, and the sister is also a staff member for the LAM Foundation. So this was how we started, one way that we started working with the LAM Foundation in pulling off and executing this meeting. So from our focus group, we learned a lot of things we did already know, right? We hear it a lot and we kind of get the key concepts. But there were several things we learned that we really hadn't appreciated. So for example, we confirmed that epilepsy seemed to be the most bothersome problem to most people, followed by neuropsychiatric, and then by the tumor issues. But some of the things that came out that were really underappreciated, and so we built into the story to tell FDA, were things like uncertainty. Because it's so different from person to person, and we don't yet know how to predict what one person's path is going to be. Some patients describe it as like walking in a minefield every day. You don't know what part of TSC is going to pop up next. And this uncertainty really leads to stress and even fear, as described by some of them. There's strains on social life and what they can do or what they choose to do. Seizures, do they choose to attempt to live like everybody else and go out and a seizure occurs whenever it occurs? Or do they say, I'm just going to avoid the situation and not go out because we're afraid this is going to happen? Or we're concerned for the safety of our child if it does happen. The women carrying oxygen tanks, they're always treated a little differently, looked at a little differently, not to mention that it's something they have to drag around with them the entire time. And they talked about how they planned their days because they get tired. Even with the oxygen, their lungs are not functioning well because of all the cysts that are filling them up. And they talk about how they have to think about their day every day, about how much they can handle at one time and then how much time they need to recuperate. One of the drugs that's used to treat TSC that shrinks and stabilizes the tumors but doesn't eliminate them is an immunosuppressant medication. And so risks of going out and being around crowds where you could catch something that would be innocuous to most people but could be a devastating problem by being on this drug. Reproductive decisions and risks were something that the adults brought up. And then difficulties compounded by developmental delay. This really hit home with the parents of children or adult children who were female who are at risk of LAM. So you've got the adults with LAM over here who don't have any developmental issues. They knew something wasn't right. They knew they were struggling to breathe. They knew they were having exertion problems. How does someone who can't communicate because of their intellectual disability or their developmental delay even communicate to their parents that they're having trouble breathing? How are they going to deal with that? And things that we just don't appreciate on a regular basis. After the focus group, that was 12 people, and they were very different, but it was only 12 people. So we needed to broaden our input. So we partnered with the LAM Foundation to reach out and connect with a lot of women who have LAM. We publicized the PFDD meeting through social media channels, our printed magazine, et cetera, to get as much participation live or in person as we could get when the meeting was held. We identified panelists to speak at the session. So we had 2 panels of 4 at each session. So we had 8 in the morning and 8 in the afternoon. So we had 16 panelists. We made sure that they were representative of the variety of TSC and LAM that's experienced. We included some people from our focus group. We pulled some new people in. And we rehearsed the testimony, but we rehearsed it in their own words. So this is a place where we got guidance and advice, and I think it worked out really, really well. If you put somebody on a platform and you ask them to tell their story in 5 minutes, I'm not good at 5 minutes. I'm glad there's a clock down here to tell me how long I'm talking. I don't have that good appreciation of time. None of us would. And so we really asked everybody to write down their thoughts, and then we practiced it together. And we were also able to tweak things. Okay, yours is 7 minutes long, but you talked about this and she talked about that. So you could take this part out because that's already covered, right? So we can make it so that it's all in their words. We're not telling them anything to say. We're really helping them tweak and focus what they're saying to make the best use of those 5 minutes. And then to broaden it even further, we did an international survey before the patient-focused drug development meeting. So we took the questions that had been raised from the focus group output. We actually ran them by another panel by phone as well. We had another call together with a different group of people, and we said, we're thinking about these questions. What have we missed? Is there anything else we should ask? So we tweaked the survey, and then we distributed it in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French. And we shared the highlights of that survey during the meeting. So this is really a patient experience survey, if you will, and that's why that word is in the title of this talk. And then there was the meeting. Well, you're probably not surprised. If you've done all the preparation, the meeting goes really fast. It goes really smoothly. We were very pleased with how it went. We had the 16 panelists. We had 98 people there in person, 666 webcast views. We had live polling that went during the meeting. Again, we didn't invent this. This was something that FDA uses actually in their patient-focused drug development meetings. So let's do it. It's more interactive. We'll get another piece of data. Let's do that. We had facilitated discussion with the audience. So you weren't hearing just from the panelists. You would have the panelists tell their story, 5 minutes apiece, but then you had 40 minutes of discussion, facilitated discussion with the audience. And it was very intentional that we were only hearing from patients or caregivers or family members or advocates, not from doctors, not from industry representatives who were there to hear and to learn. Actually, not even from the FDA. The FDA is in listening mode. They're taking this all in. It's all about the patient focus and the patient perspective. And so afterwards, then how do you take all that has happened in this one day and all the preparation leading up to it, and then make it so it can live indefinitely and be understood by folks, including our primary audience, the FDA, right? So one easy thing, posting the webcast. We live streamed it that day, recorded it. We post the webcasts. We actually created a full transcript. That took a lot more effort than I thought, if anybody's got any tips on that, but we did it. We had 1,309 survey responses from around the world. 2/3 were from the US, but 1/3 were from other countries. We analyzed those data, and we submitted our Voice of the Patient report to the FDA. So what's a Voice of the Patient report? Well, if you've been on, or if you visit the FDA's patient-focused drug development websites, you'll see that they created, after the meetings they sponsored, they created a Voice of the Patient report that really distilled down the meeting. And we tried to copy that sort of an approach. Again, thinking, let's speak in a language FDA's used to hearing. If this is the way they're summarizing their own meetings, maybe we should summarize them that way because they'll be receptive to that. So we start with a brief introduction to TSC. Some of the people, probably most of the people who end up referring to that report will not have been at the meeting itself. So a brief introduction to TSC and some key themes, then a narrative of the day. This is what happened, this was the panel, this was what was discussed. Intersperse some quotes, some photos, some data from the survey, and then actually fill out that draft benefit risk assessment framework. So, like I said, we'll just give them the top 2 rows filled out with information from the day. And then we have a long appendix that has all the polling data, all the raw data from the survey, and high-level exports from our natural history data. So this is now kind of closing the loop, bringing back the first part of the talk from our registry, from our natural history database, and including those high-level data into the report as well. And so, in short, summarizing in their language, as I mentioned, we really filled out those top 2 rows. And then we tried to write a lot of the narrative focused on the 3rd and 4th rows, right? Kind of giving some insight into the kinds of risks that people with TSC or caregivers with TSC would be willing to accept. So they really understood the seriousness of the unmet need, so that when FDA is sitting down and filling out these things for themselves on the benefit and the risk and risk management for new potential treatments, they at least have the patient perspective there from this report to help mitigate how they think about the risk aspects of those. So a few thoughts. One is the person on the right was our 16th panelist. You probably didn't count in the picture, but there were only 15 people in the picture. Nikki here was awaiting lung transplant and has since had a successful lung transplant and is doing well. For her lamb, she also has TSC. And she joined us from remotely, so she could take part in the meeting and be and testify on one of the panels. So thoughts about considering this. So, the first question is, how will a patient-focused drug development meeting at this time relate to medical product development? That's really what it's about. Now, sooner is better than later. So you shouldn't think that you got to wait till phase 3 and something's almost ready to be approved before you do this. But there should be some connection to medical product development. If nobody's necessarily working on that because you're still trying to figure out the gene or the mechanism of the disease, you might not need a meeting like this. That doesn't mean you can't talk to FDA or that you shouldn't talk to FDA, but you might not need a full-blown PFDD meeting. Consider partnering with other similar organizations. So, we partnered with the Lamb Foundation because we had this overlap. It made a lot of sense. And many of you may have other, related disorders, whether they're genetically related or not, but still that have enough overlap that it might make sense to pool your resources and your time and pool efforts into it. Ask whether a full PFDD meeting is necessary. As I said, if you're not quite there yet because the knowledge isn't there, go and meet with FDA in another way. They've been very receptive. We did that back in 2012. Just asked, we haven't talked to you before. Can we talk to some folks at FDA? And if you need help, thinking about where do I go, who do I ask, feel free to contact me or others that you know of who may have done this and could kind of point you in the direction. And of course, learn from those who have gone before. So that's exactly what I did when we decided we were going to start planning one, was I started calling organizations that I knew who had done this. And they're more than happy to share experiences, and we'd be more than happy to share our experience. But a knowledgeable consultant can also be high value, and I put James's picture here not so much as a plug, as to acknowledge him as a Global Genes Rare Champion of Hope recipient this year. And mostly I believe, for his work in really driving and enabling so many patient advocacy groups to hold these externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. He's been a part of more than a dozen. And so, using him as a consultant was extremely high value because he used to work at FDA. Then he got his law degree. Now he works for a law firm that works, exclusively on regulatory issues and works for a lot of nonprofits. So he knows FDA's language, and he could help us speak that language. So don't think that everything I told you about speaking the language was because I already knew that. I learned a lot of it from him. I just get to tell you about it. He had lots of relationships at FDA, so he could say, you should contact this person. If you don't hear from this person, go over here, contact this person, because then maybe they can get around. He was our moderator at the meeting. He could be very impartial, again, kind of helping steer the questions and the discussion towards what FDA needed to hear, what was most important for them to hear, because we had such limited time with them. And then advice on planning and rehearsing the panelists. He did a great job with that. And he really is the one who took the first stab at filling out the risk-benefit framework. And then our staff went back and we kind of tweaked it with examples and quotes. So very valuable to have, I think, the expertise of somebody, whether it's James or somebody else, who has been through the experience and can help you. So that's our story. As I said, it's only one of many who have engaged the FDA in very different ways, but I hope it gives you some picture of at least one way of doing that. And I got 17 minutes left for a discussion, so happy to answer any questions. Megan.
Much, Steve. Oh. Is it?
Megan had a question.
Megan?
The NCATS toolkit for drug development has Steve's report that he discussed, and also, I think, Friedreich's ataxia, and does have some other resources about this meeting.
Thank you. Great resource. All those links are in the workbook, by the way. Anyone in the audience yet? If we have a, oh, okay.
Hi, thank you for taking us through all that. Yes, I will stand up so everybody can see me. So you've gone through the meeting, you've had the discussion with the FDA. What was next steps after that? And what happened?
Yeah, good point. So the next step is, of course, creating the report, which took about 4 months, I think, to get everything done. And it can be done faster. I think Friedreich's ataxia was really quick, if I remember right, and got theirs out very quickly. But the next thing is, of course, sharing it. So we sent it directly to folks at the FDA. Dr. Woodcock, we sent it to her. We were lucky enough, she actually came and gave an opening address at our patient-focused drug development meeting too. So we knew we had their attention and we had their ear. And so we sent it to the contacts and the directors of the review divisions, head of office of new drugs, all that good stuff. But we also shared it with, of course, we'll share it with anybody who wants. It's on our website. But we very purposefully share it with companies that we think, that we know are developing in the TSC space, or that we hope will develop in the TSC space, because it's a very thorough, I think, picture of that patient perspective, at least in June of 2017. And since we haven't had any new approvals since then, I think it's probably still quite accurate. And so that gives them sort of information on what to shoot for. I think the expectation is that this will be used to influence and guide the discussions between sponsors and the FDA about critical endpoints. Because the FDA has these data and can say, well, why are you using this endpoint if nobody mentioned that in the patient-focused drug development meeting or the survey or anything as being one of the top priorities? Why are you doing that? This is what they said was really important. Maybe the endpoint should be over here. So those are meetings that we're usually not a part of. And so we can kind of hope that it will be used for that point. But I do have confidence that that FDA will follow through and will keep and refer to these.
So Steve, how do you share that information with the companies and with researchers? Is this informally, or do you publish the results?
We actually, I'm sure we should have published a paper kind of on the meeting, if you will, just to get it in the scientific literature, and we didn't, and it seems a little old, seems a little late now. So that is a recommendation I would have, but there are a number of journals, whether it's like Orphanet or other journals that might be very appropriate for this kind of a story. Mm-hmm. But as far as researchers, or companies, it's really when they come to us and when we contact, when we contact them and when we find them. Some of that is since we have other research platforms that I haven't talked about, like our preclinical consortium, we're getting more contacts with companies now before they've started clinical trials. So they're looking for animal models. We've got together animal models and made those available at contract research labs where they can be tested. And so at that earlier stage, we can start to share with them already, say, here's the big picture, here's what you're shooting for, this is what the patients say they need. So we always do it very intentionally when we talk to somebody.
So you have regular meetings with your consortium of researchers and?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, we do.
Okay.
And, but even more ad hoc with companies, because they're doing things at different times and different speeds. And so we talk to them usually more one-on-one. Okay. But we do have regular meetings too.
Okay.
I just have a really practical question. Are you engaging with multiple divisions at the FDA? Because we're finding a complex disease doesn't fit necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So in the morning, we had neurology. So Billy Dunn, I'm sorry, especially since this is live, I'm blanking on the deputy director's name, but he was there also. So a number of staff from the neurology division were there in the morning. And then in the afternoon, it was from more the oncology staff, because you're looking at more tumor and cyst related disorders in the kidney and the lung. So yeah, we do speak to and deal with multiple, at least those two divisions. Derm would be another one. We didn't do that at the meeting, but there are facial angiofibromas that are present in more than 90% of people with TSC. You could see Nikki's very red face from those blood-rich, vessel-rich angiofibromas. And so that would be the dermatology division, but we didn't focus on that during the PFDD meeting.
So we've got a lot of questions here and that are being voted on by various people. You mentioned the clinician has one perspective on what is wrong with patients, while the patient has a different perspective on their primary concerns. Industry often engages clinicians and KOLs in trial design, but doesn't speak with patients until much later. Do you have any recommendations for industry on when to incorporate the patient voice in trial design?
Yeah, I would say at the same time or before they talk to the the clinician, KOL. There's a lot of emphasis on that. I was just at the Drug Information Association, DIA meeting, was at the end of June, and that's a membership organization of people who are primarily in pharma or contract research organizations who work on clinical trials. And it was a big theme through that meeting, is early and often.
Focus groups that they would conduct themselves or engaging with you as an organization?
Well, so how to do it. So when is as early as possible, but certainly when or maybe before you talk to clinicians. How? I think my first recommendation would be a patient advocacy group. Sure, well, not reaching out to individual patients on their own and doing things that are separate. I think our partnership with Novartis that I mentioned was very successful because they partnered with us on things they wanted to learn and achieve, and we could help them do that. We don't give them all the answers necessarily, but even if they're going to convene a focus group, we can help them think about these things that we've learned. What should be represented? What types of individuals, what aspects of the disease, should be represented in that focus group? What are you looking for? And we can help steer you in that direction and do it together.
Okay, here's another one. Prior to your PFDD meeting, what topics did you discuss with the FDA, and what was your goal of those meetings?
Oh, good. Yeah. So, our first meeting in 2012, I'll try not to use too much of the time, was really just simply, we haven't met with the FDA. We'd like to talk to you about our disease and figure out how we can best communicate with you, because in many ways it can seem like a big black box. So we contacted and worked with, they had a patient stakeholder engagement group, they have an Office of Rare Diseases, and they have the Orphan Products Division. Right? So those seemed the places to start. So we met with the head of the Orphan Products Division, the head of the Rare Disease, and a person from their stakeholder engagement group. Before we went to the meeting, as it was being set up, this is the piece of the story that really woke me up at what it's like to be in the patient advocacy world, and I think the influence that we really can have is, who else should be there? And I just said, well, it'd be great if Rusty Katz, so he was the head of neurology before Billy Dunn, head of neurology, it'd be great if Rusty Katz could be there, and sure enough, he came, right? They asked him, he came. And we sat in this room for an hour that was a little bit awkward at the beginning because we didn't know, neither of us knew a lot about what we were going to get out of it. But by the end, we were all very glad that it happened. We all learned something. And I think it just sort of made it easier, if you will, to say, hey, when we're thinking about this PFDD, we could kind of get in there quickly, and we already had those contacts. So I think as long as you're not wasting their time and you've got some key things that we just want to get to know you and know how we can work with FDA better, I think you can get the people that you need in the room.
Great. Anyone in the audience? Oh, okay. While I walk over there, let me ask a question. Did the meeting have an influence on further drug development in TSC? Or maybe you can talk about clinical care too. Did it have an influence?
I'm not aware of influence on clinical care. The whole, the aspect of drug development, I would say, in a way, yes, because we're really starting to push towards that preventative, right, and treating earlier. I think that's one important aspect. And I think another aspect is the importance of the neuropsychiatric issues and the problems that people experience that aren't just seizures, right? They're not, but sleep disruption, social communication. If they can't communicate well, then you often get behavioral outbursts because they're trying to tell you something, they can't speak it, and they're trying to communicate. At least that's my inference as a non-clinician. But you know, there are lots of neuropsychiatric issues, and so we're really like trying to boost and push things forward there.
We have another question in the audience.
Steve, thanks so much for your presentation, and it's really comprehensive about the externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. And my understanding is that the FDA has issued a guidance that's mentioned in the book about the comprehensive collection of patient preferences, et cetera, last June. And they're slated to issue a couple, well, maybe even 3 more, right? So are there additional things, because you guys have already done the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, are there other ways that you can communicate with the FDA, patient preference information, patient studies, because they're fairly comprehensive in the methodology that they've included in that draft guidance. Would you mind speaking a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think you know, to the point of you can always learn more. You know, what could we have done how would we have done it differently if that guidance had been out 3 years ago, right, when we were planning it? So I do think there's an opportunity to follow up on some of those things that, especially if they would be very related to, say, a product, or whether it's just entering, I think ideally earlier, when it's just entering clinical trials or phase 2, but certainly before phase 3, to really be able to apply some of that methodology to get input on those specific questions. As you mentioned, patient preference data really infers that there are choices, right, to choose from, choose between or among, as opposed to, say, patient experience data, which I think we gathered, which is what's it like to live with the disease, what treatments do you use, that are kind of open-ended. But patient preference data can really be impactful when you do have things to choose, right? So if you were to have a treatment that prevented the onset of epilepsy but had this sort of a side effect, and you knew the risk of not preventing the epilepsy was this, which would you prefer, right? And I think there's lots of room for that as those kinds of products move forward in development, or into development, I should say.
So you somewhat talked about this a little bit earlier, but how do you get a patient-led PPPFD?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, the best, so on the slides there's a link, and it might even be in the workbook, I'm not sure, but on my slide there was certainly a link to their page, which really does a nice job of explaining that, and the letter of intent process, the LOI process. And so really the first official step on getting one is to submit that LOI that describes what you want to do and why you want to do it and when you're going to do it, and what kinds of representatives from the FDA you want. So you can have some discussion before that with FDA. I would encourage that. And they have an office that really, you know, is focused on organizing and helping external people organize these externally led meetings. So there are people you could talk to up front to really work through what goes into that LOI. But having to put together that LOI really forces you to take those first steps of crystallizing what do we want to do, what do we want to accomplish, and when are we going to do it.
We have another question from the audience.
Just to follow on to that, so how do you start dialoguing with the FDA? You mentioned you started meeting with them, and you had several meetings. I mean, do you just call them up and say, "Hi, FDA, we'd like to meet with you"? How does that work?
I do think it could be that simple. It's calling the best, you know, that best sort of initial contact. Folks at the FDA are there to help. I've been really impressed my last 8 years in patient advocacy that how responsive, how caring, and how much they want to help move things forward. So if you call somebody and they're not the right person, I really believe they're going to try hard to find you the right person. As I mentioned, there was the Patient and Stakeholder Engagement Office, which I really think has been renamed and has changed, so that's why I'm hesitant, but we could look it up together. I can help you find it. But certainly the Office for Rare Diseases or the Office of Orphan Products could, be a first call and say, this is what I'd like to talk about and what I'm trying to achieve. Who should I talk to? And they can get you to the right person.
Great. So some of these questions are related, but not necessarily related to the FDA. Do you see a trend of pharma seeking unstructured patient experience data?
I probably want to understand, be clear, I knew what the person meant by unstructured. Because if it's truly unstructured, like language, natural language processing and all that, it's how is it done, how's it collected, how it's right. So that's my biggest question on that.
Okay,
one.
well, maybe let's just leave it at patient experience data. Do you see pharma being interested in that?
I do. There is definitely interest. It needs to be relevant to what they're doing or considering doing, right? But I think there's tremendous interest around it because, as we heard from another question, there's becoming more emphasis on patient engagement early, and FDA starting to ask those questions when a sponsor comes in. Well, how do you know this is important? Did you ask patients? How did you ask them? How did you find this out? So that's becoming more common and more integrated, and so I do feel that there's a strong interest from pharma to want to get ahead of that and understand the patient experience data up front.
And this is related to TSC as a complex disease. How many specialties are involved in treating or managing, and do they collaborate and share data?
For the most part, yes. So really interesting. This paper, what's on the top of my head, this paper that was out with this fifth man with Lamb that was, that was identified. The co-authors included a genetics person, dermatologist, and a pulmonologist, right? So yes, they collaborate. They do share data, and many of them, the most collaborative ones, of course, will share patients and all of that. But the number of specialties is probably, there are 9 institutes at the NIH that we interact with, so it's probably a reasonably good estimate of the number of specialties that involve it.
Any questions from the audience? Oh, yeah. Heidi.
Did the international survey you conducted ahead of the PFDD involve the polling questions and the discussion points, or was it a separate entity altogether that James helped you with? I'm stealing your material.
Yeah. It was actually very, very similar questions to the polling questions, right? Really all focused around what's it like to live with the disease, how do you treat it, and how do you, so in the survey we could offer like 12 choices, right? And ask them to rank them and things like that, where the polling questions were much simpler.
So it was a little
But
rich for your voice of the patient.
survey is a lot more rich, but the concepts were the same.
Thank you.
We have another question over here. Did you, Troy? Oh, you can have another.
Yeah, we're building a patient registry, and we're looking at patient experiences. One of the things we really want to highlight, but it's everyone I talk to about putting the survey together says don't ask any open-ended questions in the survey. You can't analyze that data. So I'm just wondering how you deal with that.
Yeah, so that was, our focus group was completely open-ended. And so what we could do is write down all the different things that we heard them say, and then put that out as multiple choice in the survey. So we gathered what to ask specifically through open-ended questions to a broad representative subset, but the survey was multiple choice.
This question is about your natural history database versus your patient entered data. So your natural history database is based on clinician entered data. Do you think it's nimble enough to include what families really care about?
No, I think that's a gap. I really think that we need, and we would love to, it's priorities and money, right? We would love to add a patient-entered portal that collects different kinds of data on things that are important to patients in daily living and things like that, that are not easily collected in a clinical database, and link that to the clinical data. So would love to do that, and I don't think ours is complete in that respect.
That's your vision for the future.
Mhm.
And should patients have a right to be compensated for their data?
I don't know why there's not a right, why it shouldn't be, why the answer shouldn't be no. Yes, I see no reason to compensate them for their data. Mostly, I would say, I think and that was discussed a bit in like ethics and reimbursement and things like that. So, your IRB should approve reimbursement for time, costs, all of that for entering data. But to put a value of, say, like, oh, your data is worth $5,000, that's probably not going to fly. But to be compensated for what it takes to actually gather and enter the data, yeah, I think absolutely.
Okay, one last quick question, because we're about to end.
Can you discuss the cost of a PFDD and who would sponsor that cost? Did you, as a foundation, take care of everything?
We did. I have that number because we tracked it all. So tens of thousands, certainly not 100,000. So I'm guessing probably around 50, from 40 to 60, something like that. But I do have the exact number. Some of that depends on where you have it. We had it in a hotel, but that's because we had it the day before our research conference. So we probably saved some money on transportation and all that because we had it, we had some people coming in anyway for the research conference, but we had it in a hotel, so we had hotel catering and AV and all that. So it doesn't have to cost that much, I don't think.
Okay, and just one last comment before Christian races up there. Sorry, none of the voice of the patient reports have been uploaded to the FDA site since July 2018. However, a comprehensive list is available on the Faster Cures website. I guess that was a little helpful comment if you want to check out Faster Cures. So thank you so much, Steve. It was wonderful.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks again, Steve. And I was shared a little contact information for you as well for the FDA, which is patientaffairs@fda.gov when you're trying to reach out to them. The phone number is 301-796-8460. That's 301-796-8460. And Director of Patient Affairs Staff is Andrea Furia Helms. She is incredibly responsive and a wonderful resource to the community. So.